And
Hi, everyone. It's 2:30, so we're going to get started again. Please come on in and find your seats. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Hallette. Rich is a research ecologist studying forests across the urban to rural continuum within the USDA Forest Service's Northern Research Station, and in particular, the New York City Urban Field Station. Rich has spent his career studying trees and forest health in the Northeastern US, working towards earlier detection of tree stress caused by acid rain, exotic insects, and diseases. In 2009, he shifted his research focus from ex-urban forests to urban ecosystems. He continues to work on tree health assessment, including working with a team to develop remote sensing technology to map urban tree health. He also conducts research on urban forest restoration and afforestation. His most recent project involves working with the Nature Conservancy Healthy Trees, Healthy Cities initiative to engage citizen scientists in cities using novel science-based tree health assessment methods. So thank you, Rich, and take it away.
Hi, everyone. As Pam said, I'm a research ecologist with the U.S. Forest Service, and I started out working in White Mountains, the Catskills, Green Mountains, studying sugar maple decline, hemlock woolly adelgid, and I have had an opportunity to move into urban systems, and I found it to be fascinating. Trees are incredibly resilient, and it turns out they're useful for much more than board feet, lumber, paper. They're really valuable to our cities, urban environment, the ecosystem services they provide. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that I was introduced to by a colleague of mine working in the Midwest, where he was using trees to clean landfills. I'm going to go through some of that. We call it Phytotechnologies, and then shift gears a little bit and begin to imagine ways that we can use these fast-growing trees in our urban systems as well, and talk to you about some of the projects that we're starting right nearby here in Philadelphia, and then across the northeastern United States. So to get started, I'm going to talk about phytoremediation. Phytoremediation is using plants to clean contaminated soils. And in particular, I'm going to talk about trees today because I'm a forester. So some of the methods that trees can use to clean our soils, there's several mechanisms that I'll go through. Phyto-extraction usually just means taking the heavy metals out of the soil and sequestering them in the roots or leaves or stems. Then we have phytodegradation, where the chemical processes of the roots of the trees actually break down the compounds and volatilize them back into the atmosphere. And so in this case, it's taking organic compounds like PCBs and breaking them into their organic components, which are largely harmless: carbon, chlorine, nitrogen, things like that. Rhizodegradation, kind of the same process, working on organic contaminants and breaking them apart, breaking them down. So again, we're thinking about planting these in contaminated soils and landfills, and instead of trying to take them up into the tree where you still have the compound, it's actually breaking it down into its harmless components. Phytovolatilization, I mentioned this a little bit. It's taking the contaminant up, and as trees transpire, they can begin to break it apart and volatilize again those components into the atmosphere as harmless compounds. And then phytostabilization. This is something that trees can do mostly with heavy metals. And so it's as trees, the rhizosphere in the soil, there's organic compounds and acids that trees exude, and those acids can often immobilize the heavy metals. And so it just keeps them right there in the soil. The trees we're typically using to accomplish this are hybrid poplars and willows. And those of you who have worked in forestry for a while know that these are early successional species. They're fast growing, and they're incredibly diverse genetically. And so that means within the species, they can behave in some different ways. And you see this in cultivars for our street trees. In other words, you think about the Crimson King, maple. The tree was bred and selected to have a certain color of leaves. In this case, we're taking the genetic diversity of these two species and beginning to figure out which ones are really good at taking up heavy metals, which ones might be good at breaking down the organic compounds, which ones might be good at growing. In one case, my colleague did a study where he got them to actually grow in soils that had been flooded with oil. And they begin to break down the oil that had been spilled on the land. And not all of the genotypes work in the same way. They also have elevated hydraulic control potential. What that means is that they're just really good at sucking water out of the soil. And all trees transpire, of course, but it turns out some of these genotypes are really good at taking a lot of water out of the soil. So we put all that together. We have a system where we can begin to use some of these species that are easily propagated vegetatively. You don't have to plant the seed and grow it. But we needed to figure out a way to tailor which genotypes might work best in our system. So if we have a landfill that's contaminated with oil, or a place where we had some industrial pollution and we had organic compounds, we had to figure out which trees might do better where. So we set up this process called Phyto-recurrent selection. And we start out with a large library of genotypes. And when I say genotype, I'm just talking about trees with different parents. And because they can be vegetatively produced, we can clone them basically. It's basically just growing them and cutting up, and I'll get into this a little bit later, cutting them up and planting them again. And so you have the same genetic makeup for each one, and we know which ones tend to do better at these different jobs. But we also want some genetic diversity in the system. And so we set up this process where we can start out with a large number of genotypes like you see on the left and work down through greenhouse testing to figure out the top 15 or 12 that might go best into the exact system that we're in. The way it works is we collect soil. In this case, this is Freshkills landfill on Staten Island, where we had an experimental plot. We collected the soil from that spot, put it in boxes, and shipped it to our colleague in Wisconsin that does this phyto-recurrent selection. We get them into the greenhouse, and we can plant these trees into these trays of soil, and it's a test between the soil at the site that we're going to work at and standard greenhouse mix. And the first cycle is about 14 days. All we want to know is if we put these trees into this different soil, will they survive? And after that first cycle, some won't grow, and they sort of get knocked out, they get kicked off the island. And then in cycle 2, we grow them up a little more. And instead of just survival, we're really thinking about how fast do they grow? How much biomass do they put on? We begin to look at things like root biomass and the physiological health of these trees and these genotypes. And then cycle 3, we have fewer genotypes. And again, we're really looking at fast growth. And if we're really thinking about whether we want them to grow taller faster or we want more root biomass, this is where we begin to test that. And at the end of this cycle, we'll actually pull them out of the trays and cut them up into roots, stems, and leaves and begin to weigh the biomass to get an idea of which trees are doing better in these systems. And then after that, we've only spent about 3 months. So with trees, that's the other amazing things. Like being a forester, I'm thinking about managing forests and rotations and ages of 80 to 100 years. And so this was really amazing to me when I realized we could learn some significant pieces about forest management in the course of 3 months in the greenhouse. And then we can plant these that we've selected going through this process by growing them in the exact soils that we would plant them in our particular application, and plant them out in the field where we can continue to follow them. And so one of the places we're able to do this is in the Great Lakes Basin. Now, in the Great Lakes, we have a big pollution problem. It's one of our largest freshwater ecosystems in the world. And there are a lot of people that live in the Midwest. A lot of non-point source pollution, and it's becoming a great concern to the EPA. So we got funded by the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And we were able to put in 16, we call them buffer systems in landfills ranging up the west part of Lake Michigan and then southern portion of Lake Superior. And we've just contacted landfills that were often closed, no longer active. They'd been capped, but in some cases they were leaking plumes of contaminants into the Great Lakes watershed. And so we were able to plant these trees out into these systems. In one system, we had a situation where they were collecting the leachate from this capped landfill, and they were having to put it in tanker trucks and take it to the local water treatment plant where they dumped it in there so it could get treated and cleaned. We put in one of these buffer systems, and they right on site, and they irrigated it with the contaminated water, and the trees used the water to grow. They broke down the organic compounds through phytovolatilization and basically purified the system. And they were able to avoid trucking 1 million gallons of water a year just with this small demonstration project. That's one example. Another example is a site in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, where there had been some illegal industrial dumping of organic solvents. It turns out it was such a big problem when they discovered it they realized that these solvents were contaminating the wells of the nearby homeowners. And the city, unlike what happened in the Detroit area, the city immediately went door to door and told the people their wells were contaminated, brought them bottled water, began to get city water into them, but they still had to clean up this plume. And so one of the ways that we're trying to do this is by planting a lot of these poplars and willows at the source of the plume and to reverse the hydraulic flow. So I mentioned how effective these were at transpiring. And so if you get a lot of trees that can grow fast and begin to pump water, you can begin to reverse the flow and pull the plume back. And so that's another application. Just a couple of examples of how these trees are being used to help clean the watershed in the Great Lakes area. If you want more information on some of these projects, we've got some papers out. This is one of them that we recently put out about the Great Lakes project. So my introduction to this world was new. As I said, I came from a traditional forestry background, and then I started working in urban forestry and thinking about street trees and managing forests in cities, starting in New York City and now working in New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Hartford, New Haven, and thinking about the importance of these trees to the cities and the ecosystem services that they provide. And I started to think about places where I'd seen highly disturbed sites in the White Mountains or the Green Mountains after landslides, or thinking about out west where there were fires, and realizing that some of the trees that were coming in to these sites as pioneer species were willows and poplars. I started to think that if these species and hybrid willows and poplars we're using in landfills to clean a wide variety of disturbed sites might be useful in cities, even if we're not always seeing contamination. If you think about it, cities are urban environments are not like the environments that trees evolved to grow in. And we heard Peter Del Tredici talk about that this morning. You know, the urban environment is really not an ecological environment that they're used to. And so it requires some different tactics. And so just stop and think for a minute, you know, what you could do with some fast growing trees that are easy to propagate, that you don't have to rear from seed, in some of the applications that you might be working in the urban system. We started to just let our imaginations run and think about highly disturbed sites and thinking about maybe planting, getting a forest growing faster. And here are a couple ideas that we came up with. And we had some funding from the William Penn Foundation to sort of jumpstart a lot of this work in Philadelphia. So what I'll be talking about today are some examples that we started this year in Philly, and we're beginning to expand up and down the East Coast. What I'm talking about is moving from phytoremediation, where we're cleaning soils, into what we call phytotechnologies. And it's basically using trees to solve some environmental problems, much like we'd use engineering and things like that. And so we're sort of shifting our terminology and thinking away from cleaning soils, although that can still happen, to how we might use trees in the urban environment to solve some of our environmental problems or help us out with enhanced ecosystem services. Instead of just saying, here's a street tree, it looks beautiful, or yes, we have forests where people can walk in them and they're just going to grow without much management or attention. How can we sort of enhance these services, and how can we begin to help make our urban environment and tree environment more sustainable? one of the things we started to think about was bioswales, and you've all heard about them, seen them. Stormwater is a huge problem. I talked to some of the foresters in New York City and in the Parks Department, and they say stormwater runoff is the #1 issue they face. And so there's a big effort to put in engineered systems to capture stormwater. And typically these systems don't involve trees. We started to think about what I mentioned about the fact that they're giant straws. They take up lots of water. Can't trees be used in some of these systems in ways that could enhance the effectiveness of these bioswales and green stormwater infrastructure? So we started a test this year in collaboration with Drexel University, and we sort of took over one of their existing experiments where they had rain barrels like you see on the left there. And the previous iteration was funded by the Philadelphia Water Department, and they were just trying to get a handle on which soil mixes might be most effective in these green stormwater infrastructure systems, and looking at bare soil or a control versus black-eyed Susans in this case, just forbs, herbaceous things that they planted in these bioswales to help with aesthetics and to keep the soil stable. So they were done with that experiment. They had these barrels. They're sitting on basically a scale. They have an outlet at the bottom where water can run out, and they're instrumented with soil moisture and temperature sensors at different depths. And so we started out by taking some of these hybrid poplars that we talked about just a minute ago and planting them in some of the barrels. We begin to look at what effect it might have on recharging these systems. In other words, after a rain event, would a barrel that's had a tree in it draw down the water faster than either the barrel with no plants in it or the barrel with black-eyed Susans? And we're working up this data now, but in the second year of data collection, we had the trees we planted last summer, at the end of last summer, growing on the right. And we also put in a poplar cutting into some of the barrels that had the black-eyed Susans in them to compare the first year of growth versus second year growth in poplars. And you can see that the poplars on the right, this is only the second year they've been growing, and they're already 4 or 5 feet tall. So very fast growing trees. And this is basically planted in sand in a barrel on a vacant lot in the middle of Philadelphia. And so we see here, basically this graph is showing the amount of water that was taken out of the system by each of the 3 possible treatments. And so on the far left, you can see that the second growing season poplars took out about twice the water after a rain event than the bare soil. And you can see that the hybrid poplars in the first season are just getting started. They don't have a lot of leaves yet. The root systems aren't well developed, but they're starting to jump up a little bit above what we saw in the bare soil treatments of the controls. This gives us hope for possibly implementing this strategy into some of our rain gardens and engineered bioswales in Philadelphia. Can we plant these trees into a system like this that, again, just has the herbaceous grasses and things in it? And can we make it more effective in the face of some of these big storms that we saw this summer? We will be hopefully planting next spring. The Philadelphia Parks Department has a green stormwater infrastructure site that they're willing to let us plant some trees in as a demonstration project and see how they do. There are a number of questions, of course, is these systems are episodic, right? Often they're just very dry and droughty. Can the trees survive that? And then can they survive the flooding that happens, because they're designed to take in lots of water and do okay. We'll be measuring this and testing it. And then the other thing, given the sort of beginning of this talk, is a lot of the water that's being funneled into these sites off of streets may have oil in them or other contaminants, road salt and things like that. These trees, if they can survive and if they can continue to be sustainable, may actually begin to clean some of the water that's coming into these systems as well as it filters through the soil and they take it up. So that's sort of one application that's sort of moving beyond the phytoremediation piece that we're doing in landfills that these trees were developed for, and one way that it might enhance some of the ecosystem services that we see in our cities. Another application we came up with the Philadelphia Parks Department was they had a playground in Hunting Park. They had a big tree that was lost in a storm. This tree provided shade for the playground, and now it's simply out in the open. And so we just did a demonstration project. We planted in May a tree that had been growing in a pot for a few months. And we went back in August, and you can see the poplar is now about 5-6 feet tall. We planted 9 of these on the south and west side of this playground, and they survived this summer. A couple of them got groundskeepers, but we hope that we can avoid vandalism. We're not that worried about it because it was actually pretty easy to put these in. They didn't really cost a lot. It's just a cutting that we put in a pot, and then we went out and planted them. If even half of these survive, and we've seen growth on some of these in 5 years, they can be 20 or 30 feet tall. They can provide shade pretty quickly to this playground. This is another spot also in Hunting Park in Philadelphia, where they were thinking about screening the highway off from the park and highway noise. And so we planted a bunch of these poplars along the, between the sidewalk and the interior of the park. And again, it's a demonstration to test of how these will do. When we put these in, it was almost impossible. I had a soil auger. The soil was so compacted, it was really difficult to even get deep enough to put the 1-gallon potted tree in. And we weren't sure if they would survive this summer. And you can see they not only survived, but they had some pretty good growth this summer. So we have some hope there. Again, we'll be looking for survival and growth next season, see how they might work. This is a bigger part of our study. Parkwood is a site in Northeast Philadelphia. It's Philadelphia Park-owned land, and they had some construction debris dumped over, I think, a couple decades. Looks flat here, but it's about 20 feet deep of construction debris. They did all the testing. It's not contaminated, at least on a regulatory basis, but it's still a pretty harsh site. And so this will be the site of a trial that we put in where we take these willows and poplars that I just talked about and use them as a nurse tree planting to create a forest here. And when I say nurse tree, I'm talking about interplanting these willows and poplars with American elms that have been bred to be resistant to Dutch elm disease, American chestnut, again, that have been bred to be resistant to chestnut blight, and some other desirable species. So in other words, as you know, we have a big problem with exotic invasive plants in systems like this that come in and outcompete any trees we might plant there. We're hoping that these fast-growing willows and poplars will be able to jump up and create shade to keep out the exotic invasives and create an environment that's more hospitable to the more desirable later successional species. We're calling this process anthropogenic succession. And here's a quick review on succession theory. which usually covers hundreds of years. And again, we're talking about sites that have been highly disturbed. And in a natural system, we see, you think about, after a volcano, for instance, or again, a fire or landslide, it takes a long time for new plants to come in and trees to get started, and it takes a while. But I think we can jumpstart this by planting in early successional species and beginning to use them to create an environment that would be more hospitable to later successional species. Another place we're using this, and we're actually starting a study in 9 cities in the Northeast, starting in Western Massachusetts and going to Baltimore, where we've identified an issue with our urban forested natural areas. These are our closed canopy forests in our cities, incredibly valuable, not often very managed. People don't pay a lot of attention to them. After all, they're forests, and forests just grow. Problem is, we're seeing storms and we're seeing loss of our canopy trees, creating gaps. And when we see gaps in our forested natural areas in cities, they often become vine lands unless there's some sort of intervention. And again, we're beginning to think about ways that we can use some fast-growing species to outcompete these exotic invasive plants and set up a system where we can get later successional species to grow by planting things like oaks and chestnuts and elms into these systems. And so we're beginning a series of experiments where we'll be implementing some of these strategies in our forest gaps in our cities to see if we can't make them a little more sustainable, and also thinking about the practicality of what we're doing. In other words, not spending thousands and thousands of dollars an acre to keep the exotic invasives out. And hopefully this is a more sustainable system where we can set up a system where we have less human intervention that's needed. And I'm really careful to talk about reducing the amount of human intervention. As you know, in our cities, our trees always take some care and our forests always take some care. So it's not like we'll set it and forget it. We're always going to have to keep going back in and monitoring, but we're hoping that we can come up with some ways to make this a little easier and require less. This is a project that we're doing in Baltimore, Maryland. This is sort of a community engagement effort. And it also represents sort of a new area for me, in that I've been working with parks departments across these cities in the Northeast. This particular site is about a 5-acre piece of forest owned by a church, Still Meadow Community Fellowship. And this is a spot that has been forested for many decades. It's owned by the church, it's used by the congregation, but emerald ash borer came in and about 6 or 7 years ago, I think, and killed the ash trees. These ash trees were big. They're 20 to 30 inches DBH, and they were starting to fall down. It got to the point where the people couldn't go into the forest anymore. It wasn't safe. Anytime there was a windstorm, you had dead limbs falling out of these trees. And so our Baltimore team, Forest Service team, asked me to come down and take a look at it. And we began to come up with a plan to get these unsafe dead ash trees down. But once we open up that canopy, there's a lot of exotic invasives in there. And so we're beginning to work with the community to get some of these willows and poplars into the forest. And we're working with volunteers to do that. Here's one of our volunteers right here. But the other piece of it is, given that we are the research branch of the Forest Service, we're also on the hook to do some scientific studies. So we got them to work with us on implementing an experimental design on this site where we could test a couple of things that we're interested in. And one of the things that we wanted to test, again, getting back to the feasibility of doing these interventions, is can we plant cuttings into the forest? And by cuttings, I mean 8-inch sticks of poplars and willows that you just shove in the ground and they grow? Or do you have to put them in a pot first and grow them for a year? And so we did just that. We had about, I think, 600 potted trees that we planted. Let's see, we did our planting this spring. So the year before, we planted them in pots and cared for them and grew them up in 2-gallon pots, I believe they were. And then we're putting half of our plots in as cuttings, where we just shove these sticks in the ground this spring. And we collected, we're again working up the data on this. We collected our first growing season worth of data a few weeks ago. Here's an example of a cutting that we planted in June on the left. And on the right, there it is in August. What sort of anecdotally, again, I haven't worked up the data yet, we're seeing a pretty high mortality on the cuttings versus the potted trees. But again, if you think about it, and we need to sort of look at the numbers, we're planting them about 3-foot spacing. So it's pretty dense. Even if we lost half of those trees and we could get the other half to grow up and create shade, that might be feasible. And versus the potted trees, I'll show you a picture of how well the potted trees did this year. And so these were the 2-gallon pots planted in the spring, and now they're about 12 feet tall. This is one of our best, I cherry picked this one. This is one of our best examples. Not all of them did that well, but some of them are doing that well. So we'll see. We're going to continue to follow this over the next growing season. I'm particularly interested in finding out if the cuttings that survived and actually got a good start and a root system this year, I think we're going to see similar growth next growing season. And so we'll begin to get some numbers on whether we can just go in and shove sticks in the ground or whether we need to pot them and plant them that way first. And so sort of moving on to the feasibility of this, thinking about how you can accomplish this in your community or your city to provide propagation material to get trees out into the city. It's actually not that hard. This is what we call a stool bed on the left that we planted in Philadelphia this spring. It's basically finding a spot where you can keep track of the genotypes, and we plant them on 1-foot center, and we put the sticks in the ground. We have landscape cloth down to keep the weeds down. And then during the dormant season, you can go out and cut them and cut the sticks off and harvest them into 8-inch sticks and put them in a refrigerator until you're ready to plant them in the spring. And you soak them in water for 48 hours, and then you can either put them in pots to grow them up or put them in the ground to get new trees like I was demonstrating earlier. And this is our stool bed in year 2. So you can see that this summer, our genotypes are now about 6 to 12 feet tall. They're going to provide the genetic material for a lot of our experiments that I mentioned in our network of cities throughout the Northeast. And we think that this one stool bed will provide a few thousand trees that we can plant in our studies. It's not that hard to create or maintain. It does take some effort to keep track of the genotypes because, again, we want to make sure we're keeping track of which ones are doing well under certain situations. So we can begin to get a catalog. Just as I said, you know, we have for phytoremediation, we know which ones do good at taking up heavy metals or breaking down organic compounds. We can begin to create a library of genotypes where we know that they do best in green stormwater infrastructure or in forested natural area gaps or in construction fill. Begin to keep track of this. But this can provide the genetic material that we can use to get these things out into our cities if any of these techniques work. It's not that expensive. It's pretty easy to do, not technologically very difficult. And each year you basically in the winter, whether you're going to use the material or not, you have to cut them off so they can regrow, so they can create these tall stems for you using the same root system. Oops. And at this point, I'll open it up for questions. I think we have a little more time, and I'd be happy to talk about ideas and yeah, so the question is the gaps in deer browse. And I was attending the deer session over in the next room before this. It's a huge problem. And so all of our experiments are fenced. And we're playing around with ways that we can do this. We're hoping that, you know, if we can get these trees up above where the deer can reach, maybe the fencing can be temporary, just a few years before we pull it out and use it somewhere else. We're looking at a product called Deer Buster, which we think we can, you know, move around. But yeah, exactly. You know, to get these gaps reforested in the presence of deer is almost impossible. So, good question. That's what we're thinking. Yeah, and if we can do that, and then we're thinking about maybe underplanting later with later successional species as a strategy. But yeah, deer is a huge problem pretty much everywhere.
I have a couple questions right here.
Oh, sorry.
Do you do any plannings on composite caps, landfills?
On capped landfills?
Yeah, where you have soil over a synthetic?
Some fresh kills, there's a lot of discussion about that. And right now the current doctrine is the trees will impact the cap and break the integrity of it. So they don't allow it. Other landfills, there's been some research done saying that the trees don't break the integrity and that they can grow on top of these areas. And they hit the cap and the roots just spread.
Right.
The only issue potentially is if the trees get bigger and they fall over and there's a big branch that might puncture it. Depends on the depth of the cap.
Right, given that most root zones are within the first 2 or 3 feet, if you added additional fill, would that make it safer?
Yeah, that would definitely help. I mean, again, these trees can grow. I mean, look at trees in tree pits. They don't have much soil. They don't need much to do well. So, yeah, and in the Midwest, there are some landfills where we are planting these on the capped portion as well.
Cool. Thank you.
Just a quick question about the cuttings. Now, I guess you said you refrigerate them. You don't do the old method of just digging like a 2-foot pit and bundling the cuttings together and let them callus over?
No, we haven't tried that. My colleague in Wisconsin has been doing this for a couple decades, and the method they've used is just cut them up and keep them in the fridge and keep them cool. Yeah, yeah.
For those cuttings, are you varying the spacing on different plots too to come up with an ideal density that would be effective for the invasive control?
Yeah, so the density question, we're thinking very much about that, and we've got a couple of studies that'll be going in the ground where we'll be varying the spacing on the planting to figure out, you know, what level of intensity is necessary to keep the exotic invasives out. But yeah, that's very much a question.
Hi, I was wondering if in just the reforestation areas, if there's a reason why we can't use native species early succession trees.
So why can't we use native species? I've been working on a few studies in New York where we started out with the native tree species, and on some of these highly disturbed sites, what's desirable is typically later successional species, and they don't do well unless they're a little more shade tolerant. And so we're beginning to think about, you know, instead of planting it like a garden, you want this color flower here and there, preparing the site in some fashion where we can get to where we want to be by using earlier successional and moving into later successional species. And we're playing around with different strategies for that. New York City in particular has a policy. They don't want to use hybrid willows and poplars. They only take genetic material from within a 200-mile radius of the city. It only has to be native for their natural areas plantings. And so in that case, we went and collected willow and poplar cuttings from Staten Island and propagated them in the same way and planted and working on planting them into the sites. We do know that the hybrid willows and poplars that we've been using for our phytoremediation projects are much more easily propagated because they've been selected for that. And they're typically faster growing, like we heard this morning about the hybrids typically doing a little better. So, but there is sort of a concern in some of our partners of only using native genetic material, and that certainly is possible. It's just a little more difficult. Yeah, great question. The question is, so these hybrids, are they safe from getting out in and becoming invasive? And the answer is yes, they're safe because they're sterile. They don't create seeds. And so it's only vegetative propagation that they can be spread by, and that would be by us creating the cuttings and planting them. So they're not going to get out into our forests.
Yeah, a suggestion first, which is that even if people have the microphone, you repeat the question, because often they don't speak clearly into the microphone. We can't hear it.
Certainly.
Okay. And then I was wondering about phytoremediation. Has anybody looked at the fate of the contaminants that are taken up by the trees? Like thinking about heavy metals, sooner or later, they're going to be released back into the environment. And then also even the organic materials, are they always broken down into harmless materials? Or do they sometimes make them into something even worse? That's
Yeah.
all.
So two great questions about what happens when the trees are used to clean landfills. And in the case of things like heavy metals, they're taken up by the roots or into the stem. And yes, they're still there. And so what happens? Now they're out of the soil, they're more concentrated. And so if it's taken up into the stem, you can harvest these trees and take them to a biomass plant and burn them. Heavy metals are still in the ash, but now you have a smaller volume of hazardous waste. Part two of your question involved the phytovolatilization or the breaking down of the organic compounds like PCBs, TCEs, things like that. And are they always safe? Those organic components of these compounds are typically carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, chlorine. And so once you break it apart and deconstruct the complex molecule that is causing the problem, yes, it's safe.
Any other questions?
Great.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hallett.
Thanks, everyone.
So we're a little early, so we can